St. Petersburg, February 1885. A single column in the newspaper Severny Vestnik carried the headline, "Merchant's family found dead inside their own apartment. Neighbors speak of unusual silence." It was barely more than a paragraph. Tucked by the turn of the century, the grome of tragedy had faded from newspapers but not from memory. The apartment, sealed for several years. By the mid-1920s, the silent house on the English Embankment had acquired an almost mythic reputation. Few dared to cross its threshold, yet its presence was impossible to ignore. A city guide published in 1924 makes only a brief mention. No tenants since 1910. Neighbors advise caution. Those who did enter, whether out of curiosity, duty, or academic interest, reported experiences that defied explanation. In 1921, police archives record the visit of a local photographer commissioned to document the building's interiors. His plates, recovered decades later in a private collection, show a dining table set precisely as it had been in 1885. Chairs aligned, plates untouched, candles faintly glowing. But in one image, an extra figure appears, a shadowy man seated at the far end, not listed in any documents, his gaze obscured by the low light. Investigators who examined the negative noted the figure disappears in no fewer than 3 successive exposures, as though caught between moments. Around this same period, tenants temporarily assigned to the apartment by municipal authorities vanished without record. Their meals were found on the table, warm and arranged, though the bodies were gone. Witnesses spoke of hearing faint scratching at the walls, whispers in a language unknown, and sometimes the subtle creak of floorboards in rooms that no one occupied. One archivist wrote, "I swear, the walls breathe. They do not settle, they whisper." A surviving photograph dated 1923 shows the building's exterior at dusk. Shadows of passers-by are captured, yet a dark silhouette lingers at a top-floor window, taller than any known occupant, motionless, watching the street below. Scholars who examined the print noted the figure bears resemblance to the long-deceased Ivan Gromov, though the image is decades later. Attempts to trace the original negative failed. It had vanished along with the photographer. The legend persisted in oral tradition. People claimed watches and clocks slowed or stopped when held near the flat. Horses pulling carriages refused to enter the street after twilight, neighing and balking inexplicably. Children dared each other to touch the door handle, only to recoil and panic, convinced the house knew them. In 1928, a university student who entered briefly described the temperature dropping sharply and the air feeling viscous, as if resisting his movement. He emerged hours later, disoriented, and refused to speak again about the interior. Archival research conducted in the 1930s revealed marginal notes, annotations crossed out in black ink, and references to the apartment under the heading Dom Bezvuka. One line, preserved despite censorship, reads, "The silence preserves. It watches. It waits." No further records exist of what happened to subsequent investigators, tenants, or officials who approached the building. Yet the apartment remains, locked and unaltered, standing like a relic. Today, the English Embankment still hosts the silent house. Passers-by claim that sometimes, when the river fog drifts low, they glimpse candlelight behind curtains. Long untouched, pocket watches pause inexplicably. A faint draft carries the scent of roasted fish, and for a moment, one can feel the weight of centuries pressing through the windows. The final question lingers, unanswered, whispered among archivists and residents alike. Have you passed by it today? And did you notice the silence is waiting for you, too? The house endures, its mystery unresolved, a presence that refuses explanation. It is not history. It is not legend. It is simply there, patient, silent, watching.
Property to be leased once more. Few were eager to occupy it, yet poverty and circumstance compelled some. The first new tenants were a civil servant and his wife. Within a month, neighbors noticed familiar signs. Windows left open in the dead of winter, curtains unmoving. The couple appeared increasingly withdrawn, rarely leaving, was eventually reopened. Officials declared the matter settled and allowed the flat, pale, and listless when they did. Then, without explanation, they vanished. The apartment was found empty, tables set with plates, bread unspoiled, a bottle uncorked. No trace of departure was discovered. Their belongings remained, yet the tenants were never seen again. Police reports filed at the time are inconsistent. One draft suggests the pair left for Moscow. Another claims they may have drowned in the Neva, though no bodies were recovered. Both accounts lack substantiation. Marginal notes in the archive folder, written in a different hand, remark only "second occurrence." No further inquiry was made. A decade later, in 1905, a family of 3 rented the same rooms. They, too, soon grew silent. Neighbors recalled hearing the child laugh once in the courtyard, but in the weeks that followed, nothing more. Then came the same discovery: supper untouched, chairs pushed back slightly from the table as though someone had risen abruptly. This time, the bodies were gone entirely. Only impressions in the dust, faint outlines of where figures had sat, remained. The police again recorded little. Witnesses claimed the silence inside was thicker than before, a void that weighed on the lungs. The officer in charge submitted his resignation days later. His file contains a note: "Unfit for further duty. Complains of pressure in ears. Nervous agitation." In 1910, rumors persisted that students from the nearby university broke into the flat as a dare. No official record survives, but oral testimonies suggest at least one of them never returned to lectures. Others, when questioned years afterward, spoke only of a table set for guests and of hearing a faint ticking that stopped the moment they noticed it. One described a figure in the corner, barely visible, which dissolved when they turned their head. They refused to speak more. During the same period, an archivist at the City Hall grew curious and began compiling references under the heading "Dom bez Zubuk." His notes, partially preserved, trace the apartment back to its construction. Built in the 1830s by a wealthy textile manufacturer, the building replaced a small convent destroyed in a fire. According to church registers, the convent had once sheltered victims of plague. Some believed the land was sanctified by burials, though no graves were marked. The archivist noted, "Foundations laid upon forgotten ground. Silence, not absence, but inheritance." His file ends abruptly. The final pages torn out.
Throughout these years, the reputation of the silent house deepened. Residents avoided the stairwell, preferring to climb 2 extra flights to use a back entrance rather than pass its door. Carriage drivers refused to stop on that side of the street at night. Children whispered dares to touch its brass handle, said to be colder than ice. Some claimed to see faces behind the shutters, though the rooms had been unoccupied for months. Others reported glimmers of candlelight within, steady and soundless, unshaken by the draft of the river wind. By the 1920s, the building itself began to decline. War and revolution scarred the city, and maintenance faltered. Yet the apartment remained untouched. A tenant list from 1921 shows a line struck through where its occupants should have been recorded. In the margin, "Closed by order, do not assign." The reason is not given. Still, stories spread of soldiers billeted there during the civil unrest who later refused to speak of what they had seen, of archivists who entered to catalog documents and emerged trembling, unable to recall the hours spent inside. The silence of the Gromov apartment became a silence of memory. No one wrote about it openly, but the name survived in whispers, repeated in corridors, in the margins of files, and in the pauses of conversations when people glanced toward the English Embankment. A presence, invisible, yet enduring, as if the apartment itself demanded to be remembered not with words, but with quiet. And always the same refrain: meals left waiting, windows open to the frost, and silence that swallowed even the faintest breath.
Between notes on city markets and ship arrivals, yet the details unsettled even the seasoned readers. The Gromov household, father, mother, 2 children and a maid, discovered lifeless at the dinner table. The bodies strangely dried, preserved, as if untouched by time. But the strangest remark came from the residents of the building. They all agreed on one thing. For weeks before the discovery, the apartment had been The following morning, St. Petersburg awoke to scandal. Newspapers devoted not front pages, but discreet columns to the tragedy. The authorities urged restraint, fearing public unrest, yet the tone of the reports betrayed unease. The Severny Vestnik wrote, "A peculiar incident has taken place in an apartment of the English Embankment. The merchant Gromov, his spouse, offspring, and servant were discovered lifeless, seated at table. No signs of violence nor of decay were observed." Another paper, the Petersburgsky Listok, hinted at something darker. Neighbors spoke of a silence of extraordinary nature, oppressive and continuous, which surrounded the apartment prior to discovery. We refrain from repeating the more fanciful testimonies, though some insist the stillness could be felt upon the stair.
Passages Landing swore she had heard footsteps that did not echo late at night, as if the stone stairs absorbed the sound. A young clerk told colleagues that he knocked at the door one evening and thought he heard whispering inside, though when he pressed his ear against the wood, there was only a void that seemed to stretch endlessly. Others recalled seeing the family alive only days before, pale and strangely subdued, avoiding conversation, walking as though in a dream. Rumors turned quickly into legend. It was said the house had been built on ground once belonging to a monastery, where dozens of monks had died during an epidemic. In the weeks that followed, stories multiplied. An old widow who lived across the embankment landed swore she had heard footsteps that did not echo late at night, as if the stone stairs absorbed the sound. A young clerk told colleagues that he knocked at the door one evening and thought he heard whispering inside, though when he pressed his ear against the wood, there was only a void that seemed to stretch endlessly. Others recalled seeing the family alive only days before, pale and strangely subdued, avoiding conversation, walking as though in a dream. Rumors turned quickly into legend. It was said the house had been built on ground once belonging to a monastery, where dozens of monks had died during an epidemic. A local priest, interviewed much later, recalled hearing whispers that beneath the foundation lay forgotten graves. "The earth remembers," he told an archivist decades later. Some silences are heavier than words. Whether true or not, the story spread across the city, repeated in taverns and whispered in marketplaces. The English Embankment, usually known for its elegance, became a place citizens avoided after dusk. Meanwhile, the investigation proceeded. A young scientist from the Imperial Academy of Sciences was sent to the apartment to examine acoustic irregularities reported by the constables. His notes, preserved in a dusty folder, state, "In the central rooms, sound propagation behaves unnaturally. Clapping of hands produces no echo, not even the faintest reverberation from the walls. The environment consumes vibration. It is not absence of sound, but its extinction." He left the house shaken, writing to his superior that he refused to return without further instruction. The physicians tasked with examining the bodies reached no conclusion. Autopsy reports were inconclusive, describing organs that appeared desiccated, as if drained of moisture, yet without any trace of disease, a condition unknown to medical literature, one doctor scribbled in the margin. Some remarked that the skin of the deceased retained the pallor of the living, stretched thin but not decomposed. And there was the matter of the eyes. Each member of the family, though lifeless, had their lids half open. Witnesses said it seemed they were still looking outward, fixed on some unseen presence just beyond the edge of sight. Workers sent to seal the apartment complained of pressure in their ears, as though descending into great depths. One wrote in his report, "My hammer struck the nails, yet I heard nothing. I felt only the vibration in my arm." The men demanded double wages and refused to remain in the building longer than necessary. Within days, the apartment was locked, its door bearing the wax seal of the police. For passers-by on the embankment, its windows remained shuttered, but some claim that on certain nights a faint glow pulsed behind the curtains like candlelight in a tomb.
Official statements attempted to quell hysteria. The city government declared the tragedy a case of sudden illness and ordered all further commentary suppressed, yet the legend grew stronger. By March, whispers of the silent house circulated across Petersburg. Some swore to hear nothing when walking past its facade. No clatter of hooves, no roll of carriage wheels, no crunch of snow. Others insisted pocket watches ceased ticking when carried near the building, resuming only after they had passed beyond sight of its windows. Whether fact or imagination, the house acquired a reputation no official decree could erase. Years later, when archivists combed through sealed files, they found references scratched hastily in margins, then struck through in black ink. One phrase repeated more than once, "Dom bez zvuka," the house without sound. The title clung to it,
enduring long after the Gromovs' names had been forgotten. Silent. Not merely quiet, silent. St. Petersburg at the end of the 19th century was a city of contradictions. Along the granite embankments of the Neva, palaces of noblemen stood beside damp courtyards filled with beggars. Fog often rolled from the river, covering the lantern-lit streets in a pale, uncertain glow. The Gromov house was not extraordinary. A solid four-story stone building on the English Embankment, its windows looked directly onto the slow waters of the Neva. Ivan Alexandrovich Gromov, a merchant of the Second Guild, lived there with his family. Their neighbors, government clerks, widows, minor nobles, described him as a man of moderate wealth, respected in trade circles, often seen in church on Sundays. Nothing marked the family as unusual, until the silence began. The first to notice it was the seamstress from the second floor. For days she heard no sound above her, no creaking of floorboards, no conversations, not even the clinking of cutlery at mealtimes. At first she thought the family had left for their dacha outside the city, but she recalled seeing Gromov himself only 2 days ago, returning home in his heavy fur coat. Other tenants confirmed the same. The family was present, yet their apartment seemed like a sealed chamber where all noise was swallowed up. The laundress told police later, "Even when you stood by the door, you felt something pressing against your ears, as if the air itself refused to carry sound." Police patrols had already been called once. A report from February 3, 1885 states, "At the request of tenants, we attempted to ascertain the state of apartment number 12 belonging to merchant I.A. Gromov. Knocked several times, no answer, door locked from within, no sounds audible." The patrol left assuming the family was away. But in the following nights, rumors spread. One lodger swore he heard slow breathing in the stairwell when he passed their door at midnight. Another insisted the windows were sometimes open to the winter frost, yet the curtains inside hung perfectly still, untouched by the wind. These accounts, preserved in witness testimonies, reveal a growing unease among the residents. The building's doorneck, an elderly man named Andrei, later recalled in questioning, "It was the silence that frightened me most. In other flats you hear quarrels, prayers, the cries of children, but there, nothing. Once I thought I saw the chandelier move, though the windows were shut. I stood in the courtyard and looked up, and I could swear the shadows inside moved without a sound." His statement was dismissed at the time, but it would be repeated in different forms by many others. The silence was not absence, it was presence, heavy, suffocating, unnatural. And still, the Gromovs themselves were seen entering and leaving, their faces pale, their movements slow, as if they too were prisoners of that quiet. February 8, 1885. The fog that morning was so thick the outlines of the Admiralty vanished across the river. Andrei the doornik returned from shoveling snow in the courtyard. He looked up at the Gromovs' windows. They were half open, though the air outside froze his breath into mist. Curtains of heavy brocade hung without movement, as if pinned to the air. Later, he swore to investigators, "The wind cut through my coat, yet those curtains did not stir. It was as if inside there was no air at all." At the time, his words were dismissed, but they appear again in the preserved testimony of neighbors, each describing windows open to the frost, yet stillness within.
On the night of February 12th, a decision was made. A group of residents gathered at the district police. The family had not been seen leaving the house for 3 days. Candles glimmered behind the curtains, but no footsteps, no voices. Patrol officers recorded, at 23:15, attempted to summon by knocking, no response. Neighbor attests light visible from within, door locked. The command was given to force entry. The heavy oak door splintered under the blows of a crowbar. It opened onto complete stillness. The patrolman later wrote, "The silence within was of such nature that it seemed one's own breathing was impertinent." The first room entered was the dining hall. There, at the long, polished table, sat the entire Gromov family, Ivan Alexeyevich at the head, his wife Anna beside him, their 2 children, Pavel, age 12, and little Sophia, age 8, along with the maidservant Daria. All sat upright, hands resting calmly on the table, faces turned slightly toward the door as though awaiting guests. They were lifeless. Yet the skin had not rotted, nor the bodies decayed. They appeared as figures carved of wax, their features dried, tightened over bone, preserved without scent or stain. A constable whispered in his deposition, "It was as if they had been seated like this for weeks, though their eyes were not closed." On the table lay the remains of supper, roasted fish, black bread, bottles of kvass, but unlike any meal left for days, nothing showed signs of spoilage. The fish glistened as though just pulled from the oven, the bread still soft, the drink clear. An officer touched a piece of bread.
He wrote later, "It was warm." This was recorded, then crossed out in the official copy, but preserved in his personal notes discovered years later in archives. Even the candles on the table, burnt halfway, had not dripped wax. They stood perfectly still, their flames faint, steady, and without sound. The atmosphere of the apartment was unlike any the policeman had known, a silence so dense it pressed against the skull. Each man swore he could hear his own pulse in his temples, the scrape of boot leather deafening in the void. One constable clutched his ears, saying it felt as though the air itself vibrated, though no sound carried. In the parlor a clock ticked, yet its hands never moved. They hung frozen at 22 minutes past 3. The men stood in that room longer than they intended, struck by the oppressive stillness, until their captain ordered them out into the stairwell to breathe. The silence, he later wrote, followed them out, lingering in their throats like smoke.